Now let's shift from sport licensing and talk a little bit about media relations. This first video will be kind of an overview of media relations, some things to think about, and then the next video, which will be the last in the class, will be about sports information directors, which we'll talk about in just a second. So let's talk about some media. Media relations is a big part of what we do and part of the history that we've seen in our United States and our world. And so as part of your discussion, what I want you to do is answer these couple questions on D2L discussion board. First is, a lot of critics argue that today's sports reporting is obsessed with scandals and celebrities. Do you agree with this statement? And the second follow-up question to that is, what role does that suggest culture plays in the communication process? And then the second question I want you to answer is, if Babe Ruth were playing today, would he be treated differently in the sports media than he was in the 1920s? If you need to look at a little bit about Babe Ruth and his personal life, you can do that through Google or other types of searches. But if you think that he would be treated differently, in what way? So answer those couple questions before you move on to the next video. But let's start talking about media relations. Media relations falls under this umbrella of publicity. As a reminder, publicity is any non-personal stimulation of demand of good, service, or business unit. It is similar to that of advertising in that it is non-personal, but it is different. And the key to the definition of publicity is that it is not paid. Advertising is paid non-personal. Publicity is not paid non-personal. So in this, we have individuals that are employed by sport organizations, commonly called sports information directors. Sports information directors will talk extensively in the next video about their job duties, but sometimes they're called something different. Sometimes they're called media relations specialists. But essentially their job is being marketers for individual sports, the individual teams within an organization. So some organizations will have media relations specialists. If they are an NFL team, their only job is that team. However, if we have sports information directors, we typically see them at college athletic programs. And so this is a screenshot or the image of our own SFA athletic department. We have 3 people. We don't call them sports information directors here. Their titles are media relations director or assistant director, and they come from our athletic media relations department. There are 3 of them, and as you can see, they have multiple sports they cover. So, for example, Rand Champion, who's the director of media relations, covers our football team, our golf team, and our bowling team. So anything that has to do with the athletes in that organization or the events that happen, he is the one that deals with the media and makes sure they have the proper information. We also have assistant director Charlie Hurley, who does men's basketball, volleyball, baseball, and tennis, and Carrie Burns, who does women's basketball, soccer, softball, track and field, and cross country. And so they are essentially marketers for the individual teams in which they represent. Smaller organizations such as Division II or Division III, they may only have one media relations specialist that does every sport. And so depending on where you go, your job duties typically change. But at the most basic level, your job is to be press agentry. In other words, you are creating and distributing information to the media. So let's talk about communication process and how it works in sport organizations. It includes a lot of different players, and I want to mention who they are first. First one is the sports information director. We've mentioned who that was. They answer questions and information. They're basically the marketing or PR person for the entire sport organization or for that individual sport. The local media would be another player. These are television, newspapers, radio, internet sites, anybody that's trying to seek information about the activities of that team. We have the player and her or his family. This is the subject matter. This is what we also sometimes call the content providers. This is sometimes becomes the communicator, and we'll talk about that in a second. And student athletes obviously have a less role in this in communication because of the protection they receive. Professional sports are a little different. We also have the coach, who is also the subject matter and also sometimes considered content providers. They also assist in protecting players, especially at the college level, and they're also information source. The athletic administrators, so these would be athletic directors, presidents, owners of organizations, and they sometimes act as the coach in some smaller organizations. but they are also sometimes considered content providers. And then the last one is our sports audiences or our consumers, and they are the outcome variable. In other words, they're the ones that drive all of this. Their demand dictates what media covers. In other words, no one's going to read it or watch it, then the media is not going to cover it. So let's look at this idea of these different players. First of all, we have the sports information director, and they're kind of in the center of this. And then they work directly with the local media, newspapers, television, radio. Local media sends a request to the SID. The SID then sends information back. It may be a request for an interview, but it may just be a story or a write-up of the game. So game notes pre or post game. We then also have the player or the player and their family. This player and the family has protection, especially at the college level. The SID is the one that protects the local media and anybody else from getting to that player. The player then directly deals, and the family deals with the SID, Sports Information Director. So if the local media wants to do an interview, they have to go through the SID, and then the player comes to the SID and they set that up. However, in professional sports, and because of the advent of social media and the limited constraints that many organizations have on that, the player or the family could go directly to the local media, which makes the SID's job a lot harder. Then you also have the coach, obviously. That coach then is also another protective line between the player and the local media, trying to control that message, and works alongside the SID. You also have the administration, and administration works with the coaches, making sure they're sending messages that are appropriate, as well as working with the SID to ensure the structure is set up appropriately. And then finally we have the sports fan, or the audience or consumer. The local media sends them for information, and at the same time the sports media or sports fan also deals with the player. And so this is kind of seems somewhat of like a complicated method, but at the center of this whole thing is the SID. And so in media relations, these are the jobs that many people have that are considered marketers for individual teams, and one of the reasons why I wanted to show you this. So let's talk a little bit about the sport communication model, the old versus the new. The old sport media essentially was, we saw the earliest known sports media coverage was in 1733, and a Boston newspaper described one of the prize fights. We first saw the national coverage of sport begin in the late 1840s, and this was again coincided with, and we'll see throughout this history of communication, coincided with technology, and that was the telegraph was invented in the late 1840s. In the 1850s is when we started to see this first model, which I'll show you in a second, begin. The traditional media with newspapers and magazines, the radio, and then finally television in the 1950s. Teams traditionally had to beg for media coverage. Essentially what they would do is say, hey, we've got an event coming up, please come out. Now we see that's a lot different. But because of publicity, sport became what they are today. With publicity, we know that rights to cover broadcast and media are often paid for, and those come with fees. Those fees typically, depending on the organization, can vary. So, and based on the time. In the 1960s, CBS paid $394,000 for the rights to broadcast the games in Rome. And in 1962, the CBS paid $4.65 million for the rights to broadcast the NFL. We see today those are multi-billion-dollar contracts. We also saw a change in sports history in that we started to see a change from the 6 to 7 day work week to a 5-day work week. And before there was not a whole lot of time for spectator sports, and now we saw that there was. We also saw that sport and media oftentimes had a different relationship than what we see today. Media traditionally had complete control over what the consumer saw or what they heard, and sports were generally seen as being positive in nature. Part of the reason was society as a whole had a lot of economic turmoil, and positivism during economic turmoil was a good thing for our society. People wanted to rally around positive points, and that being sports. We also saw there was a focus on something outside of the monotony of work. And so we saw that the relationship between players and reporters was more of a friendship rather than a working relationship. So because the media relationship was strong, we saw media had complete control over what the consumers saw as far as sports go, and they wanted to broadcast only on radio if they could. But really what we started to see was a change in the agenda setting function. So, for example, Bear Bryant was quoted as saying, "You folks," the networks that is, "are paying us a lot of money to put this game on television. If you want us to start at 2 in the morning, then we'll tee it up." So we also saw an increase in technology, which changed the model. So technology was limited in the old model, was really focusing on radio until television came along in the 1950s. And there was a quality and lack of media outlets was also a problem. In the 1950s, there were only 3 major television stations: NBC, CBS, and ABC. This meant that until the 1980s, there were only 1 or 2 athletic games broadcasted per week. And so we had a very small amount of sports that you could watch on television. Because there were fewer games broadcasted, we know that broadcast media such as television and radio primarily did just in-depth analysis of teams and games. And on the other hand, print media was more for your daily recap. So if you wanted to see the score or the outcome of a game, you would open the newspaper the next day and see it. However, on television would be more in-depth into one game or one team. So this is the old model, the characteristics of the old model from 1850s to the 1980s. What I've been discussing the last couple minutes was the sport, athlete, the organization, the event, and the news were all basically content providers. They provided content to the media. The media decided what to distribute to the mass sports audience. And there was a relatively no feedback. Only feedback they got would be letters to the editor. But we saw a change essentially in the old model in that people started to innovate. And so, for example, there's a guy named Tex Schramm. Many people may know him as the general manager of the Dallas Cowboys, and actually was the one that coined the term America's team. He fought for media coverage, and many times he wrote stories himself and sent them to the newspapers. He made comment about free agency and was famous for doing that, and that the players were the cattle and the owners were the ranchers. He was an innovator in both media. He also argued that this idea of the cattle versus the ranchers when it deals with players and owners, and that the media used to be the ranchers and the teams were the cattle, and that they decided what they would control, what they would produce and distribute. And he basically changed those things. And so today, in the old model started to fade away in the 1980s when he really tried to change the face of the game. And this began in the 1970s with technology and innovation. In the 1970s, we started to see the first time for pay cable television. The problem we had was satellite technology was really limited. In the 1970s, we started to see society as being, we started to see the arms race between United States and the Soviet Union. We also opened avenues by adding these satellite technology for sport consumption. This gave rise to a lot of sports such as mixed martial arts. And to give you a little case study, mixed martial arts was founded in long time ago, but in the 1970s we started to see the sport of jiu-jitsu combination came from the Gracie family. Roy Gracie, who's pictured here, was famed as basically being the guy who expanded the sport and the popularity of MMA in California after he opened his gym. We had an increase in sport event and broadcasting and television, and so in the 1970s we started to see pay-per-view with the violent nature of mixed martial arts being a no holds barred type of rules. A lot of people had an issue with this. So one of the major issues was that this type of event is censored by the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, and while the FCC claims that they don't actually regulate violence on television, they do place violent ratings on systems in today's broadcast. In the 1970s to the 1990s, there was a relatively low censorship in that pay-per-view events were allowed to be pretty much anything they wanted. However, there was the image of the MMA was hard to sell in the public's mind, and part of that had to do with politics. And so the reason I have a picture of John McCain here is that John McCain, who was a Republican senator at the time in Arizona, he stepped in and tried to take the lead in the fight against mixed martial arts and getting it banned in the United States. McCain, who was a lifelong boxer or boxing fan, felt that the games were too barbaric and that they had no holds bar rules, and that was pretty much anything was allowed except for eye gouging, spitting, and hair grabbing. Everything else was pretty much fair game. And sent a letter to all state governors in 1996 requesting that all events in those areas be banned, and many of them followed along with that. So it wasn't until the sport reconfigured its rules that it started to become more popular. But all of it had to do with the advancement of pay-per-view television and satellite technology. So some of the things that we saw in technology changes which influenced the new sport model is fiber optic cables. Fiber optic cables gives us the ability to carry information 65,000 times more than the conventional copper cables which we were using. And so there are other issues with the new model. There were legal issues. So until the mid-1980s, ABC had control over all NCAA broadcast. In the 1984, some of the bigger time programs filed suit against the NCAA, stating control of one network was against antitrust laws. Those programs won. And we started to see the introduction of new regional networks where teams started to become profitable. So you saw the Fox Sports regional networks such as Southwest, SNY in New York, Michigan Regional Sports Network, so on and so forth, come into play. We started also seeing the new model, multiple consumption options. The internet provided opportunity for us to watch it through other devices such as Xbox, Xbox Live, and ESPN3 now. We saw new markets started to be able to be created. We started to see, without essentially demand, these markets wouldn't be created, and the new model media started to cover anything unless the sport consumer didn't read it or watch it. And so we started to see more and more avenues for sport. Internet examples, we started to see consumers become more involved through the internet. So sport fans started to use the internet to become consumers themselves. So Max Preps is a good example. High school sports, TexAgs for Texas A&M, things such as small as Division III athletics. You had D3 hoops and D3 football. Even officials started to get together online to try to engage in the sport more often. We also saw this idea of the hyper-local sports media coverage. We saw an increase in the media's attention to local sports. This was based on geographical location. So football and baseball teams in Texas were more popular as opposed to basketball and hockey up north. But we started to see national networks starting to cover local sporting events such as in-state rivalries for high school football. ESPN covers high school football now. Regional networks obviously do the state championships and other games as well. We also started to see examples of regional sport networks, so ESPN Dallas, ESPN Houston, all examples of that. We started to see a growth in ESPN itself. It started to expand to different product lines, which we had discussed earlier in Chapter 7. This growth had to do with television, in that the ESPN and ABC fell under the same roof. That of the Disney network, they had 7 domestic cable networks. They had regional syndicated networks. They had paid subscription packages and were in international markets. They were in radio, international radio, syndicated international radio. They got online, ESPN.com, Deportes, Radio.com, Soccer.net. They started to expand into print publishing. So ESPN the magazine, ESPN Deportes. They own Bassmasters magazine, Bass Times, Fishing Tackle and Retailer. They also started to produce ESPN books. They started to emerge in different technologies online. ESPN On Demand, 360, ESPN3 now, ESPN HD, ESPN2. They had interactive TV, wireless. They had mobile ESPN. They also started to produce consumer products, so CDs and DVDs. So they did the Jock Jams in the 90s. ESPN video games. They had golf schools. They had racing schools. They had trading cards. They had the ESPN 30 for 30s. You see all of these ways that they're trying to expand in the new communication model. They even started to host events. So the X Games, the Winter X Games, International X Games, ESPN Outdoors and Bass, the ESPYs, bowl games, the Jimmy V Men's and Women's Basketball Classic. All of these were examples of the growth of ESPN because of the new consumption model. A lot of it had to do with social interaction. And so we had a variety of fan outlets. People started to go on blogs and message boards and chat rooms. They tried to seek people who are similar to themselves. This is where social identity came into play. They tried to find people who shared an interest in that, and it was easier to do that in the new model. And then they also started to try to shift from traditional media outlets providing sport contents about individual athletes and coaches, and now we started to see fans to communicate directly with it. And so with the old model, we had a lot of new changes to this. We had an interaction between the mass media. They start to cover through publicity. We started to send content through sports information directors. They started to distribute it to the mass media, distribute it to the sport audience, many of them being very niche or niche markets, and then communicating directly back to the consumers themselves. And then you had all kinds of different interactions. So the sports media audience or model, started to change a lot after the 1980s, and specifically the advent of technology in the 1970s and 80s.